Our gospel lesson is found in the gospel according to Matthew, chapter number 25, and I'll begin reading verse number 31. When the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, then he will sit on the throne of his glory. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate people one from another as a shepherd separates sheep from the goats. And he will put the sheep on his right hand and the goats at the left. Then the king will say to those at his right hand, "Come, you that are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you gave me clothing. I was sick, and you took care of me. I was in prison, and you visited me." Then the righteous will answer him, "Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry and gave you food, or thirsty and gave you something to drink? And when was it that we saw you a stranger and welcomed you, or naked and gave you clothing? And when was it that we saw you sick or in prison and visited you?" And the king will answer them, "Truly I tell you, just as you did it to one of the least of these who are members of my family, you did it to me." Then he will say to those at his left hand, "You that are accursed, depart from me into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was hungry, and you gave me no food. I was thirsty, and you gave me nothing to drink. I was a stranger, and you did not welcome me, naked, and you did not give me clothing, sick and in prison, and you did not visit me." Then they will all answer, Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry or thirsty or a stranger or naked or sick or in prison and did not take care of you?" Then he will answer them, "Truly I tell you, just as you did not do it to one of the least of these, you did not do it to me. And these will go away into eternal punishment, but the righteous into eternal life." May God bless the reading and hearing of this word. May we be blessed that in it we will hear a word that is to us from God. As you know, I like stories. Most of them that I tell are true. This is the story of Watermelon Joe, and it is a true story. The story itself, I have to warn you, is longer than most of the stories that I tell in church, so I will ask you to humor me like a guest at your Thanksgiving table who tells stories that are too long. But I do hope that it will help us to engage this very familiar text. Before I tell you about Watermelon Joe, the story needs some background and context. In my time as your pastor, I've managed to get Stephanie and I have managed to get all of our children here except for one. His name is Spencer. He is my oldest son. Hopefully you will meet him someday. He is 34. He's a fine and bright fellow. Before becoming a grown-up, he was a curious and inquiring child. Curious and inquiring children often become very intelligent adults. Spencer's no exception to that rule, and I don't mind saying it even if it makes me guilty of bragging a bit. But that is the joy of having a curious and inquiring child. They become intelligent adults who you can brag about. But before that happens, before they become intelligent adults, you have to get through some earlier stages of having a curious and inquiring child. For me, it meant that my tools often went missing, having been used for some purpose, not the purpose for which they were designed, but for some purpose nonetheless, and they managed not to make it back to the toolbox where they had been taken by my curious and inquiring child. It meant that I was asked why, even more often than most parents are asked why. It meant that because I said so was never a sufficient answer. This is the same child who heard me say from a pulpit much like this one that God is everywhere, who then asked me while at Sunday lunch, if God is everywhere, why do I have to go to church? Having a curious and inquiring child meant for me that I came home one day to find a computer completely taken apart. After a minor meltdown, I was then surprised that he put it back together, added something to it that made it a better computer for playing video games. All right, one more piece of background before we get to Watermelon Joe. Early one summer, a young man came to our door. He knocked, and I opened the door to be informed that he was selling Bibles. I told him that he had unfortunate luck and I was the worst house to come to, that I was a pastor and I had a solid collection of Bibles already. We talked a bit, however, and I was able to learn a little bit about him, enough so that I learned that he and his Bible-selling partner were sleeping in their car for the first couple of weeks that they were there until they got a couple of paychecks so that they could rent a small room somewhere for the summer. They were selling Bibles as a means of putting themselves through college. I told him that he and his partner should come back after they finished their tour of our neighborhood, and I talked it over with the family, and when they came back and we discovered the other young man was just as nice a fella as he, I invited them to stay for a couple of weeks until they were able to rent that small room. Now, I'm not recommending to you that you, especially when you have small children, that you invite strangers into your home, but these were different times. They stayed for a couple of weeks and they were able to then rent their apartment. But before they left, on the bedside table, they left a brand new King James Bible with a note in it that said, "Thank you for your kindness. It has helped us to believe we are in the right place and will have a successful summer." I felt good about it. And this passage even came to mind that we read this morning. I'm going to admit to you that I patted myself on the back. Perhaps too much. But stay tuned, a humbling experience was coming my way. At the time, my parents lived in Atlanta, and we took our annual trip to visit them for a week. Coming back, we found ourselves in the rain for the entire trip. And then, as we were passing through Greenville, South Carolina, with the rain impairing my vision enough that I didn't see it, we hit a pothole on the interstate, which I hit at roughly 60 miles per hour. It jolted us all, but I breathed a sigh of relief when everyone seemed to be okay. It was supper time, and we pulled off the interstate to eat at Shoney's. We were clearly in the Bible Belt because everybody was still dressed for church. Looked like they had just gotten out of their Sunday evening service. After eating, we went back to the van where I discovered that everything was not okay. The tire that had hit the pothole was flat. And so I got out in the rain, going to find the jack and the tire tool that I would need to change the tire. It was then that I discovered in the back of our minivan an empty well where the tire, tool, and jack should have been. I went over to my curious and inquiring child and I said, "I don't think I want to hear the answer, but I also think I already know the answer. Do you know anything about my jack and tire tool?" To which I learned that he had used it to experiment on something in the garage. It was still there in the garage. Meaning, it was 3.5 hours from me. I assure you, it was a perfectly functional jack and tire tool, but it wasn't doing me any good in Greenville, South Carolina. I went back to the flat tire. I put my hands on my hips and I looked at it. I looked at it as if I looked at it hard enough, it would change itself. It didn't. Now enter into the story. We're getting close to the end. Watermelon Joe. A gentleman who's probably about my age now walked over to see what was going on in his Sunday clothes and asked if I needed any help. Boy, did I. He went back to his truck and came back with a jack and tire tool and helped me to remove the flat tire. In fact, he did most of the work. That's the thing about men. If it's our tool, we want to be the ones to use it. Together, we then examined the spare tire, and we came to the same conclusion. For most purposes, it would suffice. But in the rain and with a 3.5 journey still in front of us, it was too dangerous. We were both standing there soaking wet when Joe told me that he knew a guy. I had just met Joe, but for some reason I was not surprised that Joe knew a guy. He seemed like a guy who would know a guy that could fix just about anything. Well, while the family waited inside with Joe's wife in the Shoney's where we had eaten, I got into Joe's truck and we drove over to a garage which had been opened by this guy just because Joe had asked. In the garage were an assortment of used tires. We looked them over and picked out one of the better ones, and the mechanic mounted it and prepared it and put it in the back of Joe's truck. One more discovery awaited me. I didn't have enough cash to pay for the tire. And when I asked the mechanic if he would take a credit card, he smiled and he waved his hand around the room and said, "Does this look like a place that takes credit cards?" Well, there were 3 deerhead, a boarhead, and more largemouth bass than I could count upon those cinder block walls, and no, it didn't look like a place that would take credit cards. I was also not surprised when I learned that Joe did most of his business with cash. He pulled out his wallet and he paid his guy. I promised that if he would share his address, I would mail him a check. He said that if I sent a check, he wouldn't cash it. And to be certain that I wouldn't send cash in the mail, he refrained from giving me his address. And he referenced, just briefly, this very passage that I read this morning. When I couldn't convince him otherwise, I said, "I've got a curious and inquiring 7-year-old in the van. I'll trade him for the tire." Joe declined my offer. Back at Shoney's, we put the new tire on as the rain continued. We shook hands. I thanked him profusely for everything he'd done, and we said our goodbyes. I found a golf towel in the back of the van and was there drying myself off as best as I could, and I saw Joe walking across the parking lot with a watermelon in his arms, soaking wet. He knew that children like watermelon and that we would enjoy it at some point when we got home. I told him once more that I had a 7-year-old who I would trade for the tire and the watermelon. He still declined. On the drive back home, things eventually got quiet. Everybody else was asleep, and it gave me a chance to reflect. It was the watermelon that got me. After all that he had done, he felt the need to offer one more gift. I kept saying it in my head. A watermelon. He gave us a watermelon. I reflected as well on the young Bible salesman we had helped and how that felt. And I found myself comparing that feeling to the feeling of being a recipient of that kind of extreme generosity. It's a humbling feeling, but it's also an empowering feeling to know that somebody deems you worthy of such generosity, even if the only reason for it is because you are a fellow human being. Now, with that long story over, let's consider this passage. It is a familiar one. Among us progressives in particular, we reference it as a guide to how to live our lives, as a guide to how to be church. With the help of a blogger named Richard Swanson, I thought about it in a different way this week. It is important to note not only what is different between the sheep and the goats in this famous passage, but what they have in common. What separates them is that the sheep, when confronted with the hungry, fed them. When confronted with the thirsty, gave them water to drink. When confronted with a stranger, welcomed them. When confronted with the naked, clothed them. When confronted with the sick, took care of them. And when confronted with the prisoner, visited them. The goats, in those same moments, stayed uninvolved for whatever reasons were their own. It could have been callousness or indifference. It could have just been fear or busyness, something else more important to be done. That's what made them different. But we must catch what made them the same, what they had in common. They were both surprised that at any moment in their journey, they had encountered a divine being in those encounters with the least of these. Whether they were being commended for generous living or judged for their failures, they both asked the same question: when did we see you hungry or thirsty, or in the presence of a stranger, or naked or sick or imprisoned? When did we see the Son of God and help him? Or when did we see the Son of God and turn away? Now, those of you who are biblical scholars or who were just paying attention when I read this morning know that I just misquoted this text in a significant way. The Son of God is never mentioned in this passage. The reference is to the Son of Man. Now, Jesus is referenced in that way and speaks of himself in that way on a number of occasions, but I don't think that it's an accident that the humanity of Jesus is lifted up in this passage. This is the thing that Richard Swanson helped me to see in a new way. I am not unusual as a preacher in that I make almost weekly references to the importance of seeing the divine in all of the human beings whom we encounter. No matter our differences, no matter what might be the off-putting exterior, we are compelled to see the divine presence in everyone. That sounds great. I believe it to be true. I would consider it a core value to aspire to. For that matter, I'll probably say it again next week. But here's the thing. Neither the sheep nor the goats had any sense of seeing the divine in any of those who were among the least of these. Their generosity was not contingent on their capacity to see the divine in the least of these. Their generosity was not driven by the fact that they were able to observe and embrace that divine presence. Their generosity was driven by the fact that human beings were in need. That's it. No one is praised in the story for seeing the divine presence, and no one is judged in the story for their lack of that same vision. The judgment hinges not on the capacity to see that presence, but on how the judged responded to human beings. Swanson concludes his observations this way. The goats appear to be planning to sue the sovereign, since if they had known they were supposed to look for God in the smelly people under the bridge, they surely would have looked, or at least sent a servant to look for them. The sheep also never saw the sovereign. They just saw people who needed to be fed or protected or valued or respected. They just saw people and treated them like people. It never occurred to them that they should be looking for God, and they are commended for that. This is not a story about seeing the divine in the least of these. This is a story about seeing people as people. Let me conclude with this. Thank you, Joe. I don't know where you are, or even if you are still in this world. But thank you for seeing me and my family as human beings. And that because you saw us as human beings, you deemed us worthy of extreme generosity. Thank you for the help. Thank you for the tire. But above all else, thank you for that watermelon. It was a gesture so kind that I have never forgotten it. And I suspect that I never will. So thank you, I say, to Watermelon Joe. Amen.